And without further ado, let's welcome Arkie.
Hey! There's a bit of fire in here. So I'm here to talk to you tonight about my label, which is self-titled, it's Arkie. So essentially what I do is I do a lot of print-based developmental fashion pieces. So I do work in a commercial area, so moving forward with my label, I'm hoping that I can go into galleries as well as boutiques and showcase my work. So I recently graduated in fashion design and marketing at QUT, just across the river. So I guess what I'm working on now is really developing my practice with my designs and my print work and textile work into the fashion that I have here. So I guess where I come from is I've always been quite creatively expressive with my work and everything that I do. As a young child, I always did a lot of artwork. I'm a practice fine artist as well. So I started from the age of 4 doing a lot of abstract and contemporary work. My heritage is from Mount Isa, so my dad and his family are from there, from the Kalkadangu tribe, which is where my Indigenous heritage comes from. So I did a lot of contemporary Indigenous Australian artwork with him, and a lot of exhibitions when I was a lot younger at galleries in South Bank, for the Abused Child Trust, everything like that. So that was something that I was really heavily involved in when I was a lot younger. So I think moving into a fashion context is something that I'm really interested to see how this develops, because I think a lot of people are looking towards fashion as a way to experience and express artistic and creative form. A lot of my artwork, I've got it on the flyer, handed out to a few of you. That was my first artwork, which can be seen. I actually have printed onto this scarf as well. So I guess that's one of my more hand-worked pieces. I did that one when I was 4, and I thought it might be nice to kind of apply that to a fabric and textile quality in a recent small collection of scarves that I did for the Fleet store, which was actually in the foyer of the State Library last year. So I guess what I'm kind of here to talk to you about tonight is the connection that I see between contemporary Indigenous Australian culture and fashion design. I think it's quite an interesting way to look at accessing contemporary Indigenous culture, and a thing that I talk about a lot, and particularly recently that I've started to think about a lot more, is the disconnect between mainstream Australians and contemporary Indigenous culture. I think that whilst there is quite a basic underlying understanding of Indigenous culture, it can be quite stripped back and not necessarily a developed understanding. Like, everyone can recognise and understand your cliche souvenir Indigenous art, but might not necessarily understand how wide a genre it actually is and the different movements within it. So something that I've always been particularly inspired by is the contemporary Indigenous art movement of the Utopian women. So they use like an amazing array of colours and are always constantly inspired by nature, which is something that I've always been inspired by throughout my artistic endeavours, as well as now developing into my fashion design. I think that it's an interesting way to look at kind of creating a platform for people to interact with contemporary Indigenous culture on a new and more personal level, because I think that fashion is something obviously that everyone interacts with on an everyday basis. It's an interesting way for people to kind of see the stories behind contemporary Indigenous culture and really interact with them, because I just feel like there is less understanding as there possibly could be of this huge world that's so important to our Australian culture. So I guess not just that, but a lot of my designs have like an innate sense of the Australian leisure life, and a lot of them are quite youthful and relaxed, and I think that's also something that I want to bring in, is not just Indigenous Australian culture, but that real sense of laid back, relaxed Australia. That is something I think we can all relate to, especially being so close to the beach. Like the beach culture is definitely something that shines through. I recently went down to the Melbourne Fashion Festival and showed with the Indigenous Runways project, which I found incredibly interesting. There was a huge array of designers showcasing through that, from First Nations to Maori designers to Indigenous Australian. And I met some really incredible people there, which I think kind of goes to show like what I've experienced is that Indigenous Australian designers, it's more of a community rather than a competition, which I think is kind of how it should be, especially it's not really the case in mainstream fashion. So it's really good to see that through curatorial art as well as fashion in Indigenous Australia. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at this stage. I'm in the process of developing my first collection, which will hopefully be in production by the end of the year, and sold through boutiques and galleries. So at this stage, like I've got a lot of my print works in development, which is a huge part of the fashion that I do. A lot of the silhouettes are quite simple and easy to wear, but the prints are really the winner of the styles, I guess. So yeah. I've obviously brought along a fair bit of what I've been working on. Some of the stuff behind me is more of my conceptual work that I developed through my degree in fashion design. So it's a little less wearable, but it's kind of was the launch pad for me moving forward with my label, as opposed to it just being a concept and an idea. So yeah, I mean, you've all got a flyer that I've made. It's got some of my new print works on there, as well as just like a brief outline and history of kind of where I've started. Obviously, like my practice is quite new, especially in a fashion context, so it's quite exciting moving forward. And I think the main thing for me is that I want it to be commercial. I want people to be able to buy into this Indigenous story and the culture, and really be able to understand and relate to that on a more personal level, rather than just an aesthetic, I will buy this because it's fashion. So yeah, I've got some pieces that I brought along with me if anyone wants to come and have a closer look. And if anyone has questions, please go ahead. And I'd love to, yeah.
You talked about having stories in your artwork. Do you have stories for the items behind you?
Yeah. So generally the stories are embedded into my prints. So rather than the silhouettes or the outfits, each print has a different story behind them. So this print here is the Rainbow Dreaming print. So I think that's a story that everyone's quite familiar with, like the rainbow serpent and the creation of the land. So I think that is something that kind of is worked into every one of my prints, is that it relates back to nature, which is such a huge part of Indigenous culture, is that relationship to the land and the understanding of nature and what that means to culture. So yeah, I mean, that one's these ones, and this one is the black spinifex print that was in my black spinifex. So yeah, so that's the spinifex plant print. And then I think on the flyer I've got a couple of the new prints, which is like the waterways, kind of bringing those blue tones into that. So yeah.